probably for the best. Okay, so, well, hello everyone. Good to see you all again. My name is Helen Nde, and I curate a platform called Mythological Africans. And it is a space on the internet across different social media outlets where we explore mythology and folklore from the African continent. And as Sam mentioned, I have contributed to Romancing the Gothic before, talking about different aspects of African folklore or folklore from different African peoples, as I like to phrase it, so we don't give the impression that it's just one people. And it is my honor and my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about archetypes of womanhood in my book, The Runaway Princess, and other stories. So maybe we should start by giving some background about the book. And this book is an outcome of the last 2-ish years of delving into folklore and mythology from the African people. And something I noticed was that while there were all these many stories about women and girls, when you start looking at the stories and how women and girls are presented in different ways, there tends to be a dearth of full-fledged representation. The idea that, okay, these are full human beings with thoughts and feelings and motivations outside of the expectation that you be a beautiful daughter, chaste and, obedient, a wife, fertile and, caregiving mother or grandmother, matriarch, wise woman. There wasn't a whole lot of exploration into who the different African women can be. And growing up on the African continent myself, I'm Cameroonian and I lived in Cameroon until I was 20. I knew for a fact that there is a rich, throbbing life of all these women that exists under all these, ideas and stereotypes. So I wanted to explore that a little bit more in my book. So the book is, it's out now in ebook format only because the printing got a bit complicated, but there are print copies floating around. And what it does is it's 20 stories retold in verse or as prose, focused on girls and women from different aspects, from different parts of the African continent. And what I did was break the continent down into 5 sections. And from each section pull a number of stories so you get a full-fledged representation. And what I hope to do today is explore the different ways in which women show up in my book, the characters in my book. So that is the topic of our talk today, female archetypes in The Runaway Princess and Other Stories. And so how this will play out is we will start with just getting a sense of what an archetype is to begin with, right? I have a pretty good suspicion that everybody in this room has been exposed to some extent to what archetypes are, but we'll just go over that for anyone who might have, doubts or questions. And then we'll look at how archetypical images show up in folklore from around the world. And then we will look at women in African folklore in specific, what archetypes and stereotypes are usually associated with them, and the conversation and small controversies around that. And then we will zero in on certain characters from the book to explore what archetypes they embody. And it will be helpful if you have read the book, but if you haven't, what I will do is for each character that we look at, I will give an overview of her story. And then I'm hoping this can be a bit of an interactive session. So I will be asking you folks to, comment in the chat, just share your thoughts on what you think is going on, and hopefully we can do it that way. So what is an archetype? Well, this is a term, a concept coined by Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who I'm pretty sure everybody in this room knows. And these are patterns or ideas or behavior that are embedded in the collective unconscious of humanity. And how I understand this is that you have the weight of human history history, existence, everything that people have said, done, felt, thought, recorded or unrecorded. And this could be recorded in art or books or song or all the ways in which we capture our experience. But there is also the part that is recorded in our minds, in our psyches. And an archetype then is a pattern that emerges out of these collective memory, this collective awareness of who we are as a human being. And I think about it as I think some of you may have seen this video of how some people will put sand on a surface and then use some sound to touch the surface and vibrate the sand. And what you see is the sand will organize itself into different patterns, circles, lines, squares, and whatever whatever, depending on the frequency of the sound. So I think of archetypes as these patterns that emerge from collective awareness of who we are as a human being. And as you can imagine, these patterns have become rich fodder for the different efforts that people have made to understand humanity. So Carl Jung himself, in his writings, from what I understand, came out with 4 main types of archetypes. There is the shadow, which is the part of ourselves that is not, obvious to everyone else, our deep inner feelings and thoughts, usually repressed, usually has to do with sex and basic life instinct, survival, and all of that. And then there's the persona, how we present ourselves to the world. And as I think about it, our graphic user interface, what people see when they interact with us, who people know us to be. And this is sometimes described as a mask, the implication being that it's not always the real person who we are. There's that shadow aspect that is suppressed. He also talked about the anima or the animus, and the anima is the female image, a man's awareness and experience of what it might be like to be a woman, and the animus, which is the woman's idea and experience of what manhood might be like from her perspective. And then there is the self, which is an integrated version of what is conscious and unconscious in us as a human being. So these were the 4 main archetypes that Jung defined. But he also acknowledged that archetypes can be broken down into multiple things. They can be themes or motifs, patterns that emerge in the human experience, like birth and marriage and apocalyptic events or floods or deluges, things that in societies all over the world have shown up over and over again. An archetype could be a stage of human development, so being a mother, childhood, fatherhood, sisterhood, and things like that. An archetype can be a personality trait, so a rebel, an explorer, a lover, a trickster, different ways in which people will behave and the patterns that emerge around them. And an archetype can have to do with your occupation or your function in society. So a queen, a warrior, a magician, a teacher, a healer. An archetype can be formed around that. A pattern of behavior or experience can form around that as well. Now, archetypes have a special place in folklore because what folklore and mythology is the repository of given people's experience of the world as recorded in stories, in poem, in song, in art. And so, as you can imagine, these patterns tend to show up as cultural symbols, right? And they're passed from generation to generation as we pass down these stories. And in our modern age is in the literature that we read and watch and put out, content we create, right? Since we're in the social media age, archetypes will show up in all of this material. And so they have become the framework for numerous analysis of folkloric and literary characters. Women in particular have certain archetypes associated with them, and they exist on a spectrum of empowerment. And that word empowerment has to do with the experience of women all over the world of this empowerment in the context of patriarchy, right? And so what you find is that the archetypes that different women will embody will range from, fully realized and empowered woman, or a woman who is operating from a place where she's not really, she's at the mercy of the forces that are affecting her life at that place and time. But then these archetypes tend to reflect the perspective of the storyteller. And I give the example of Marie-Louise von Franz, who is a Jungian analyst. And writing about women in fairy tales, she writes about the fact that sometimes you read a story and you can immediately tell that, okay, a guy wrote this story because the way he's writing about the woman, it's clear that he there's a way he sees things or the way he wants things to be. But sometimes it is a woman writing, but because of how she has been oriented in her culture, it might sound like a man is writing because she's reflecting the values and the cultures of that time. But what you also find is that in folklore, different archetypes are associated with positive or negative stereotypes, and stereotypes are judgments that we make about people's behavior. And for women in particular, these stereotypes tend to be artifacts of misogynistic bias. So the ways in which people perceive women or expect women to behave that align more with patriarchal values than with women being beings in their own rights with agency for themselves. So you find the positive stereotypes being associated with women who demonstrate the things that their society wants to see of them, virtuous choices, however they look like, desirable traits. And these tend to be, being complacent, being dutiful and obedient, being unlimited, caring in an unlimited way, giving, taking that passive role. And then negative stereotypes are the undesirable traits, right? Going against the social order, being rebellious, being outspoken, being sexual, all these ways in which women are judged. And they tend to show themselves in folklore quite a bit. It doesn't take too much foraying into the folklore for giving people to see these patterns and trends emerging. And so there are a variety of archetypical images that emerge from mythology and folklore for women, and I have some here. So these flow from the shadow, the self, the persona, the animals, and they come out in these various ways in which people can be, stages in life, character traits. And what I would want to do here is let's have a quick discussion as as well, quick discussion about what comes to mind when you see some of these traits. So take the let's go with rebel, right? When you think of someone who's a rebel, and if you can just drop your answers in the chat so everybody can see what comes to mind. Could be a character from some bit of folklore literature that you know, or what it is that a rebel embodies. What does a rebel do? Can we drop that in the chat? Lilith, good example of a woman who didn't chose not to know her place in a way of speaking, chose to go against the grain. Any other examples? Katniss, yes, definitely. Rebel basically upended that whole that whole society on its head by the choices she made from the get-go. Let's say goddess examples. They should be pretty easy. We have a variety of examples of goddesses that show up. But also I'm curious about what you think it is that a goddess does. So what makes a woman a goddess? What is it that would make a person look at a character and say, okay, she is being a goddess right now? Fertility is a very good one. Supernatural powers, yes, the power to create and often to destroy as well. Pantheons, authority, a very good one. Let's talk about the witch, for example. And I have an asterisk here because I know that I am speaking to an audience that is mixed. And in the African context, if a person is labeled a witch, it's usually with a negative connotation, right? Not to imply that that is the only way this can be understood. But just want to be sensitive to that because I know that there are people for whom, being a witch means something else completely. But in the context of this discussion, we are taking it from the African perspective where witch and witchcraft is considered a negative thing. So, right, let's go with witch. So if we're looking at the idea of being a witch in a negative sense, what are the traits and some examples? Threatening the social order, yep, absolutely. Living on the fringe, outcast, outsider, malevolent, absolutely. Let's do a lover. Threatening crops, water resources, absolutely. and a lover. Examples or character traits. Tragic, quite often, and some examples in the Runaway Princess as well. Nurturing, passive, beheld. It's one more. Rebel, long suffering, absolutely. All right, loyal. Okay. So thank you all for your contributions. And I would want to invite you to keep the different character traits you associated, the stereotypes, right? Positive or negative character traits, patterns that you associate with each of these archetypes in mind as we start looking at examples from the book, and especially as I give short vignettes of what their stories, the women that we will, the case studies that we will look at, keep these in mind as we continue with the discussion. So, women in African folklore, it's an interesting and debated topic, I would say. And this is because at first glance, the way women are presented in African folklore tends to be very negative, right? If you look at Proverbs, for example, and this has been, examined deeply in this book titled The Source of All Evil, that gives you a sense of what this goes in there. And what you find is that Proverbs about women, if it's not, encouraging um, being a dutiful daughter or being a caring wife and loyal to your husband or a grandmother who's nurturing and all of that. Outside of that, the way women are perceived and talked about can be really negative. And but this is not without a context, right? What we find is that most of the people who documented these proverbs and folk tales were men, and they likely interacted with men and with all of that the baggage that comes with that. But there's also the fact that even with the influence of misogynistic worldviews that flowed into the African continent with Islam and colonization and Christianity and all of that, there was misogyny in many traditional societies as well. There was the expectation that women fulfill a specific role, especially with when it had to do with where women were allowed freedom, right? It was usually expected that women took a specific stance when it comes to how they moved through community. Men were the ones who had a public life, and women were allowed agency, mostly in the private sphere. But also touching on the fact that a lot of this information was documented by men, and women's views were not really taken into consideration. But especially where it has to do with sexual agency, there has been on the African continent a lot of thoughtful around that. You had communities here where women had a fair amount and still do have a fair amount of sexual agency. But over time, this has shrunk and shrunk. And what you find in a lot of folklore and mythology is that the women who exercised sexual agency were demonized. And an example that came up in this book is the example of Yoruba poetry, where women were usually just castigated for exercising sexual agency, but also for being greedy, for being gossipy. There's a paper that I mentioned from Cameroon where despite the fact that in the stories the men were the ones being mainly active, the women were lambasted for being disloyal to each other, for go for not caring for each other. It's almost as if in these communities, women having friendships and taking care of each other didn't exist. If you looked at it from just the folk tales that were analyzed, betraying each other and things like that. And so this is what you see on the surface. And a lot of this, as I said before, has to do with the fact that there is a role that many traditional African communities expect women to occupy. So first, you're the dutiful daughter and potential wife. Then you're the wife, mother, or just a regular woman, fading into the fabric of your society. And then you're the grandmother, the quiet, docile widow, a wise old woman, and that's the path, the ideal path. You step out of that, you're a rebel, a trickster, a seductress, a witch, a monster. There's all these ways in which you are perceived. And so that has a heavy influence on how women will show up, because as you can imagine, not every woman was the perfect daughter, perfect wife, perfect, widow. Women would want to have lives of their own, make choices of their own, have minds of their own. And so you see them portrayed in this way in folklore. But there is another view that some analysts and some commentators have put forward, that a closer reading of African folklore reveals a different narrative about women, and this is true. I will say that this is true. There is a saying amongst African people that, well, the man may be the head of the house, but the woman is the neck that turns the head. And there is a lot to challenge in that statement because, again, it kind of refuses women that public life, that active agent in the society role, which sometimes some women might want. But there is the fact that what you find in many stories from across the continent is that the people making the crucial decisions, giving the suggestions that save the day, the people who have the information and the wherewithal to execute the actions that, keep the community together are the women. And so what you find is that in many stories, women are the carriers of wisdom, wit, and intelligence. They might not be the active agents, but it is on their understanding of their communities that a lot of the heroes in the story are able to accomplish anything that they accomplish. And this is something that Nigerian philosopher Mary Pauline Ebo states when she says that women are aware of their indispensability to the men in their community, and this assurance gives them a liberty of action that if you're not looking for it, you will not see it. There is also the fact that in many traditional African societies, before they were disrupted by Islam and Christianity, communities were set up such that if men had the sphere in which they exercised power and women had a sphere in which they exercised power. But amongst the men, there was a representative for women, and amongst the women, there was a representative for men. So they complemented each other. There's a complementarity that existed. And a story that illustrates this and why I have a spider here is a story of Anansi. And Anansi is a trickster figure which dominates African folklore. And so we know about Anansi's different exploits and the shenanigans he gets into and the ways in which he helps or harms humanity. And one of Anansi's main stories is that he brought storytelling to humanity. And in this story, Nyame, the high god, had all the stories, right? And if we think about stories as the ways in which we organize our understanding of ourselves as humanities, the narratives which we use to craft communities and plan for the future, then stories are the foundation of civilization. So Nyame, the high god, had all the stories, and Anansi goes up to him and says, well, I want stories. And Nyame says, well, if you want stories, you have to perform these tasks, and laid out 4 technically impossible tasks. He had to capture a hornet, a python, a leopard, and a muasha. And a muasha is a forest being, quote unquote, fairy type creature in the folklore of the Ashanti people. And these, at the time were not easy things to accomplish. So what does Anansi do? In most stories, he goes and figures it out and, captures all these creatures. But there is an account where Anansi goes to his wife, Aso, and says, this is what the high god wants me to do, and I don't know what to do. And Aso is the one who tells Anansi in details, gives him instructions on what to do. So basically, Anansi is a hero, but the person who actually tells the hero what to do is his wife, Aso. And you could see that as women fulfilling that sage, wise woman role. And in some readings, in some interpretations, this is a woman exercising her power in her own way. But what you find is that quite often, as we can see with the Anansi story, in most tellings accounts of this story, Aso's role is not really highlighted. Anansi, because he's the smart trickster, figures it out. And that is a way in which women's contributions to society are erased. So there are people who argue that, no, we don't want to be the neck that turns the head. We have heads of our own, we have necks of our own, and we have lives of our own. So that being said, based on the reading that I have done and some of the stories that I've been exposed to, there are many stories in African folklore where women are agents of their own, are beings in their own right, exist for their own sake in their own way. These stories, probably because of the way that they were collected and the way societies have changed, don't get that much priority. And that is something that I tried to do with the Runaway Princess, because what I did was I have all these stories about these women. And what I try to do in them is tell them from the women's perspective. So yes, this happened. And if you're familiar with folk tales, what you find is that, okay, this happened and that happened, and this person felt this and did this, but there is not a deep exploration about motives and inclinations and interiority, which is a word I like and try to use every chance I get. So what I try to do with these stories is look a bit more closely at what was going on in these women's lives and their minds and why they made the choices that they made. So the women in the Runaway Princess and other stories. The book is a collection, like I said, of retold folk tales, some of them told as short stories, some of them told as long lyric poems. And there are 20 stories in the book. And as I did the analysis, up to 66 primary and secondary characters. And for today, we will focus on the women that we see illustrated here. So first up, we will look at we'll focus on primary characters today, first and foremost. And what I have done is I have, based on my retelling, but also based on the original versions of the folk tales, come up with 3 archetypes that I think these women embody. And so what I will do is we'll go from one woman to another. I'll give a short vignette of their story, and then we can talk about why I think those are the archetypes associated with them. And if you have any thoughts about that, then we can talk about that in the question and answer session. So first off is Gadi and Huda. And Gadi and Huda are sisters in a story from out of folklore in Libya. And in their story, they have the same father but different mothers. And in the original folk tale, it is a commentary on the racism that exists in Northern Africa, because Gadi has a black mother, and so she's born, with black features, curly hair, nose-shaped, thick lips, and all of that. And Huda has an Arab mother, so she's born with long, straight hair and lighter skin and everything. But then Gadi goes on a quest to fetch eggs for her mother, and she runs into a tree that asks her to pour water on it. And she does it, and the tree blesses her to be tall and slender and have long flowing hair. And she runs into a crow with a broken wing, and she helps the crow, and the crow gives her light skin, and basically transform her into the version of a woman that people in her society consider beautiful. And Huda gets jealous and goes on the journey for herself and refuses to help the tree, refuses to help the crow, refuses to help the vulture, and basically gets transformed into a version of a woman in her society. So dark skin, curly hair, brown nose, big lips, that people find undesirable. And in addition, she's cursed and she becomes blind. That's the original folktale. My retelling picks up from after all these events. So Gadi is now this beautiful, Arab woman, for lack of a better way of putting it. And Huda is a black woman, blind and everything. And they are living with the consequences of these transformations. And it's basically their journey back to a sisterhood that was broken when they were little, because in my retelling, they were friends when they were younger. And it's because of Huda's mother, who is virulently racist and cruel, who basically indoctrinates Huda into behaving the way she behaves. And it is Gadi's willingness to be kind and compassionate towards her sister, and Huda's willingness to change and try to do better for her sister's sake, that breaks the spell, and they become their normal selves. Because as Gadi comes to find out, she may have been beautiful and transformed, but that was the value that people attached to her. Who she was, how she felt, and what she believed no longer mattered. She became basically a figurehead, right? An ornament that men from all over the world wanted. So in my classification, Huda starts out as a classic witch, right, in the African sense, antisocial, cruel beyond belief. But then she goes through her own heroine's journey, right, experiencing this transformation that basically renders her into a monster. And then she finds her way back to innocence from her sister's, love and compassion. Meanwhile, Gadi goes on a heroine's journey. She completes the tasks, she wins the boon, she comes back to her community, and she discovers that it's not all what she thought it was. But Gadi is also an innocent, in the sense that she's a bit naive about the realities of her community. She believes that there's a conversation that she has with Huda, and Huda is looking at her like, you can't possibly be this naive after all the cruelty that you've experienced. But that is was her innocence coming through, and she has her own wisdom in her own way. So that's Huda and Gadi. The next is Yenenga, who is the titular character in the story. She is the runaway princess. And Yenenga is a historical, mythical figure from the folklore of the Dagomba and Mosi people. The Dagomba people are found in Ghana. The Mosi people are found in Burkina Faso. And she's considered the founding mother of the Mosi people. And in her story, she is a warrior in her father's army, a general, right? Highly, highly ranked, because no one can do war like Yenenga. And she is so good at this, her father refuses to let her marry. And this is notable because in African cultures in general, but among the Dagomba people in particular, a woman's highest, achievement, aspiration should be to marry and have children. And so she was so essential to her father's war making and conquest that he didn't want her to marry. And in the original version of her story, she decides to run away, and her father, thinks she's going to do that, so he captures her and locks her up. But with the help of some of the men in her contingent, she escapes and runs away into the forest and meets this man who, in some accounts, is a prince running away from court intrigue on his own end, and they marry and they have a son, and she brings her son back to her father, and he apologizes and blesses their union, and their son goes off and forms the Mosi people, right? In my telling, I am trying to get into her head, right? Why would she, having this freedom and liberty as a warrior, liberties that other women in her community don't enjoy, why would she make the choices that she made? And I presented her story as a case of a woman who has seen the other side, right? She has enjoyed the freedom, and she has lived what, the dream of what it means to be a man in her community. And she comes to find out that, yes, we can go out and conquer land and achieve all these things, but that's not really what builds a community. What builds a community is care, right? And in this context, it was the women who were taking care of people in the community. And there's a conversation she has with one of her friends where she says, well, we will keep conquering land, but we need people to be in this land, and people who will not see conquest as the only way to grow as a people. So that was her primary motivation. And it's a story of her friendship with one of the men in her army, her friendship with her mother, her relationship with the other women in her community, although that's not highlighted, but also an encounter, a transformative encounter that she has with a secondary character who is kind of the sage, wise woman in the story. And then there is the Alejani princess who is not named. And in her story, she is a spirit, right? She's not a human being, a regular human being per se. She's a spirit, a magical being. And she, in my telling of the story, she is she meets this prince, an emir's son, and but she transforms herself into a monkey. And sorry, my sister is calling me here. She transforms herself into a monkey and pretends to be a monkey. But this prince binds himself to her by mistake, right? He didn't intend to. He binds himself to her, and he's supposed to marry her. It's about the original story is about him wrestling with the implications of this, right? And even though, he's just appalled by the thought of marrying a monkey, he's not unkind to her. He treats her well. He doesn't abandon her when it's clear that if he chose not to marry her, she would die. And because of that kindness, she transforms into a beautiful princess, and how fairy tales go. In my telling, I explore a very variety of reasons why that binding happened to begin with, but also her perspective on the prince's behavior. So why did she transform herself into a monkey? Why did she test the prince's patience so much? And in both the original story and my retelling, I feel sorry for the guy at one point because she really, takes him to the edge. And I set her up as a trickster primarily because of the shenanigans she gets into. But she's also a heroine in her own right, because when the prince's father falls in lust with her and decides he wants her for himself, it is with her help that he is able to outwit his father and finally gain his freedom and become a mayor himself. And she's also a lover because, in my telling, she's a lover girl and she loves her prince. There's Umhani, and oh, by the way, the Alejano princess, her story comes out of the Kordofan region in Sudan, but the culture that underlies it can be found in Nigeria and Chad and many of the areas around there. And this was one of the stories where it was hard to pinpoint the exact people from whom the culture came, because the spirits, the Alejano, are the spirits, and they show up in amongst the people from all these countries. And then there's Umhani, who comes out of Moroccan folklore. And in her story, she is just a woman who loves life and especially loves the mountains of Chawen. And these are mountains in her part of the world. And this art was done by a Moroccan artisan. This is basically a picture of what the mountains look like. And she is committed to preserving the mountains. But her lover, her beloved, her fiance, doesn't think of the mountains as living beings in their own right. And he joins a group of men who mine the mountains. So they're basically blowing up the mountains with dynamite to get, it's a rock quarry and, minerals and all of that. And the mountains, because in that part of the world, the mountains are spirits, they have jinn associated with them. So one of the mountain jinns, gets upset at being bothered all the time and creates a rockfall, and her beloved is trapped and killed. And so her story is a tragic love story because he dies. And she, for most of the story, it is her, pleading with the mountain to let her find her lover again. And eventually, at the end of the story, because the rockfall traps the man's body in a vacuum, like sealed chamber, his body is unearthed years and years later when she's an old woman and it's not decomposed, it's preserved in a way. And so I have her as an innocent. I have her as a heroine because she goes on this, pilgrimage basically to show her dedication to the mountain, but also as a lover because she loves the mountains. She loves her fiance, and she grieves both the mountains and her fiance quite terribly. And her story in the original version, it's a folk tale, but I retell it as a poem. And then there is Konara, one of my favorite characters in the story. And in her story, Konara's story is the motifs that come out of that story are common across the African continent, and I think the world. It's a strange suitor story, and it's the story of the girl who rejects all the men in her village because she doesn't think they're good enough for her. And then a stranger comes by who seems to have everything that she wants, and she decides to go with the stranger against the advice of the people in her village. And then she finds out that he's some kind of monster who's trying to destroy her. And in most tellings of the story, she either is killed or she runs back to the village where she has to settle for less than what she might have gotten if she had taken, one of the men. So it's a misogynistic story, the original account. It's usually used as a cautionary tale, to warn girls against choosing other than what their families or what their communities want for themselves. But what I love about this version of the story, which comes out of the Hajarai people of Chad, is that Hajarai people, before they became Islamized, had a very um, empowering culture for women. So women had a lot of agency, women had a lot of sexual agency. They could choose lovers before they married, and even after they married, they could choose to take a lover. And they had, ceremonies, bacchanalian, festivals where they got together and ate and drank and sang and pleasured each other. So they had a community that's quite different from what it looks like now. And in the original account, she's that typical girl who rejects all suitors and chooses instead to go with this guy. And it's a pretty humorous telling because she has a huge sexual appetite, and it's hilarious how the original folktale relates it. And but then in the end, she has a child, and as things go, she's killed. She and this monster that she chooses to go with, they're both killed, and it's goes back, reverts to that cautionary tale. So in my retelling, she is just a woman who wanted more for herself, right? Yes, she had a voracious sexual appetite, and had a huge appetite for life in general, and that was her fatal flaw, right? She's a tragic heroine in a way of speaking, because her fatal flaw was this huge appetite she had for life, which led her to love a man who, basically had an agenda of his own. But they have a daughter, and she loves her daughter, and she would do anything to protect her daughter. So I tried not to paint her as this girl who disobeyed her family and ended up in trouble. As a woman who wanted more for herself than her community was offering her, and left behind a daughter who had learned a few things from her and was resolved to grow and mature and seek things out for herself. So the positive way of looking at it, Konara is a rebel, but based on some of the things she chooses to do in her community, some of the antisocial and destructive things, she can also be labeled a witch or a monster. But she's also a lover, because she does love the man that she follows, and she loves her daughter. She absolutely loves her daughter. There's no question about that. And in my opinion, she's a heroine because she charts her own path. She has her own trials. She overcomes in her own ways. Tragic because she ends up dead, right? And then there is Kahindo, and Kahindo comes out of the folklore of the Nyanga people who are found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Kahindo is a goddess of good fortune, but she is the daughter of Muisa, the god of the underworld. And Kahindo's story is a footnote, a brief episode in the Mwindo epic. And the Mwindo epic is a story of Mwindo, a hero of the Nyanga people, who is the son of a chief and a trickster type figure. His father didn't want a son who will challenge his authority, so his father tries to have him killed as a child. And so the rest of the story is him. The rest of the story is him on this quest to track his father down and avenge himself for the attempted murder. And his father runs off into the underworld and is under the protection of Kahindo's father. And so Mwindo shows up, in the underworld looking for his father. And Kahindo is the one who basically tells Mwindo how to navigate the underworld. Without her, Mwindo would have died. Her father would have killed him. So you see that role of a woman, showing up in that, directive, strategic way. But something that is interesting about Kahindo is that she's covered in yaws. And for those who don't know, yaws is a bacterial skin infection that makes you develop all these boils all over your body, pus-filled pustules. And if it's not treated, it deforms you. So your face gets twisted, your joints get twisted. And so this is the state Kahindo is. She's a goddess of good fortune. Her father is a god of the underworld, and she's in the underworld with him, and she has yaws. So in my telling, she is not a powerless woman. She's a goddess, and she has plans for herself. She wants to leave the underworld. She wants to, live with people who will venerate her and treat her as she deserves. And she wants to be loved. And so Mwindo shows up, and the original account hints at a romance between them. And Mwindo heals her of her yaws, and together with Mwindo, they plot against her father and eventually prevail over him. But then when her father says, out of respect, I offer you my daughter as your wife, Mwindo refuses and basically says, I can't marry a woman from the underworld, and leaves her there and returns to the world above. So my story explores, her thoughts and feelings about all these things, the evolution of her feelings about Mwindo. And I bill her as a sage, and this is a bit different from how I analyzed her earlier in the talk today, because I was looking at this and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna change this a little bit. I see her as a sage because she, without her advice, Mwindo would not have made it. But she's a heroine in her own right because she goes on her own arc and triumphs and, is eventually disappointed. But that is, in my opinion, not the end of her story. And she's a creatrix in my telling because she has plans for herself. She creates a dream life, and Mwindo's arrival in her life was the first step in her achieving all these things that she wants to. So I'm thinking this is one character who I might do some more with her story, but we'll see. For now, her story is as it's told in the book. And then there is Shepi, and I think she should be, she's the last person in our analysis. Shepi comes from the folklore of various people of Africa's western coast who have a very strong culture of venerating water spirits. And she is a young girl who grows up in a village believing herself to be someone, a girl from that village, but finds out that she's ostracized because people don't know exactly where she comes from. They have a tradition in the village that when a child is born, the placenta is buried in a particular place, and the people, as they bury the placenta, speak good things into this child's life. But they didn't have that ceremony for her, so the people don't know her, and because they don't, they ostracize her, and she wonders about this for a long time until she has an encounter with one of the water spirits, and she finds out that her mother is actually barren, but because her mother was such a committed devotee of the water spirits, one of the queens of the water offers her child to this woman to say, hey, you can't have a child, but this is my child, raise her as your own. But this woman didn't tell Shepi who she was, so she grows up thinking that she's an outcast and doesn't realize that she has a family, of her own that she will eventually return to. So hers is a story of a transformation from this victimized innocent, but she triumphs over this sense of being an outcast and being ostracized, and eventually comes into her own as a someone who says, hey, I might not be one of you in the way that you might want me to be, but I am my own person, and I love my life, I love my mom, and I'm going to be okay. So she doesn't necessarily have the happy ending where everything turns on its head, but she grows into herself, and that's how I wanted to tell her story. So these are some characters in the story, but I also have a spreadsheet, and if you're interested, Sam can share it, where for all 66 primary and secondary characters in the book, I've done an analysis of my own of which different archetypes I believe they embody. And the point of this is to demonstrate that it really depends on how you are looking at things, right? There are many ways in which every single one of these women could have been portrayed negatively, could have been associated with the negative stereotypes of a particular archetype. But there is a perspective you can look at which paints them in a different light, and that is something that I want to do more of. Keep looking at women in African folklore and untangle them from all the ways in which they have been burdened with assumptions and interpretations which may not be true to who they actually are. Not to say that they're not rightfully monstrous women in African folklore, right, or girls. But one of the things that the people who protest the idea that women in African folklore are all negative, one of the things they say is that a lot of the monsters and the ogres and the wildlings and animals that disturb the peace in society are male, and quite often you find women as part of the solution, and that shows up in another story. Her character is not illustrated, although that's something I hope to remedy eventually. And the story of Takane. And Takane's story comes from the Soso people of South Africa. And this is a story of a woman who literally goes out and kills a dragon for her brother's sake. And I remember when I read one of these, I read her story in a mythological African Twitter space, which is where we get together on Friday evenings to read stories and talk about them. Someone who came from that part of the African continent was just aghast at, wow, this is amazing, because the way she was rewarded for her actions showed that she was highly esteemed in the society, and we all had a moment sitting there thinking, what circumstance in the community prompted this story, right? Because usually things happen and then people make stories to capture the event. So we had a moment there wondering what might have happened where someone felt the need to memorialize or to tell this particular story about a woman who goes to such lengths. If you look closely, there are stories of women in African folklore who embody the positive archetypes. There are numerous goddesses, trickster figures, magicians, sorceresses, although there's the baggage around that, but women with magical powers, healers, sages, numerous of these characters who embody the more positive stereotypes, but even the more positive archetypes, but even more who have been, classified as, women who are not, the witch, the monster, the rebel, and there is breaking down to be done there, because that's not the whole story. That's absolutely not the whole story. So that's it for my talk. These are some of the papers I looked at to put this talk together, and they are very illuminating in what they revealed. But if there is one thing I want folks to leave this conversation with, is the idea that yes, it is true that for to a very large extent, the portrayal of women in African folklore can be really negative, but that's really not the whole story. And I hope that my book is a step in the direction of revealing the full humanity of women, really. So if you would like to get more into African mythology and folklore, you can follow Mythic Africans on Twitter. I'm not very active recently because I'm taking a bit of a social media break. But there are threads and threads and threads of information that you can explore. There's a Mythological Africans podcast, which is recordings of the live sessions that we have on Friday. You can find this on Apple and Spotify. This was recently launched, so please check it out, if you enjoy it, and give us a rating. There's a YouTube channel where every month I do a video on a deep dive. So I do a 20 to 45 minute video exploring a particular topic, usually voted on by people on Twitter. And we've looked at quite a few things. We've looked at mythology associated with the sun, the moon, and the stars. We've looked at underworlds and otherworlds of African people. And right now we are on a series exploring sexuality in the African context. So we had an overview of just what is going on there. We've looked at heterosexuality and how people do heterosexuality on the African continent. We've looked at how intersex people who are intersex are perceived on the continent and the implications of that. The most recent video was on homosexuality, and the next video is going to be on lesbianism in the African context. So do check it out and follow the YouTube channel. There is a newsletter, which is a way to keep up with everything we have going on. So I do monthly reports on what happened and what you can expect coming forward. The mythologicalafricans.com is a one-stop shop where you can get access to all of this. There's also a merchandise store. I forgot to mention this. There's a merchandise store for characters from the Runaway Princess. So if you want this on a t-shirt, on a mug, on a book bag, you can get it. Every single one of these characters, I have them on hoodies, on mugs, on t-shirts, and the like. So you can check that out. It's all accessible from the Mythological Africans website. You can also access talks that I have given before with Romancing the Gothic. I think I have that there. I have to check. With Romancing the Gothic and with other organizations that I've been fortunate to give talks with. And I also provide research and reference search services. So if you're trying to do work on mythology and folklore on the African continent and you're looking for references or an understanding of what the material you're working with, I provide that service as well as directing you to people who might have more subject matter knowledge than I do. So that is all I have for today. Any questions, thoughts, comments? I'll stop sharing my screen here in a bit. Questions, thoughts, comments?